The scripture reading this morning is from Habakkuk, chapter 2, verses 1 to 4. I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. Then the Lord replied, write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. See, the enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright. But the righteous person will live by his faithfulness.
So today we're into the second sermon in the series on the book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk is a short book toward the end of the Old Testament. And the series is about how to live during dark days. And as I told you last time, I'm drawing upon a fellow named Tim Keller plus others. But dark days are days of trouble in our lives. They can be personal. In the last month, a number of my friends, close friends, have been told that they have very aggressive kinds of cancers. And their prognosis isn't good. That's dark days. Dark days can be for a larger community. Fort McMurray, whole city evacuated. A whole city and an area going through dark days. Or it even can be broader than that, a whole country or the whole world. Right now, country of Syria is going through dark days. During World War, the whole world is going through dark days. And so the question is how do we live during dark times? And Habakkuk is writing during a dark time in the history of Judah. The country had become corrupt. There was violence and corruption all over. And on the outside, the Babylonians were rising up in power and they were crushing the other countries around Judah. And so Judah was in dark times. Now, last time we looked at chapter 1 where Habakkuk is complaining to God. He says, look at all this evil and suffering and violence around about me. And God says, it's going to get worse. I'm bringing the Babylonians, a bloodthirsty people, and they're going to invade your country. And Habakkuk is very confused and conflicted and angry at God. And so he says some harsh things to God. And then he waits for God's response. The verses that we read today are the verses in between God's responses. It's a time of waiting. Waiting on God is a key theme in the Bible, and waiting on God is a key way for us to handle dark days in our lives. Now, every once in a while you'll hear people say, well, I'm just waiting on the Lord. Or they say to you, you should wait on the Lord. You've heard that, right? The problem with it is, I think often we don't know what that really means. It sounds spiritual. It sounds like something a pastor does or something, right? So it sounds spiritual. But what in the world does that mean? Well, Habakkuk here shows us exactly what it means. They're very practical. And in these verses, Habakkuk shows us 4 things that we can do in practical terms of what it means to wait on the Lord. The first one is waiting on God involves patience. We are to wait patiently. Verse 3 says, though the revelation awaits an appointed time, though it linger, wait for it. Habakkuk is confused and upset, just like we are when we're going through very difficult times in our lives. He's upset, he's confused, and he says, I don't understand what's going on in my life. And God says, I'm going to give you some answers, but it's going to take some time. Wait for it. It'll linger, but wait for it. And the word wait there basically is the word for patience. Be patient. Now, if you're waiting for a bus, and you're waiting and waiting and waiting, the bus doesn't come, and you're finally fed up, and I just go home. You're not waiting for it anymore. He says, wait. Wait for the answer. Or if you go to Grace Hospital, some of you have got this experience. You go to emergency at Grace Hospital, and after 6 hours, you still haven't seen a doctor. You might just say, I'm going home. You're not waiting anymore. God says the answer's going to linger, but wait for it. Waiting means to be patient. Don't give up. Waiting on God means when you have trouble in your life and nothing is making sense, when you're confused and you're troubled, you don't understand what's going on, you feel lost, instead of giving up, you have patience. Waiting on God means to be patient in your trouble. Not a lot of people say, let me start that over. A lot of people say, I wish, I'm just not a patient person. I wish I'd be more patient. But as I understand patience and what the Bible teaches about patience is actually a choice that we make. I believe that the Bible shows at least two choices, two things that we can do that makes us patient. And the first choice is to be humble. Patience is always an act of humility. In the Morden church, we had a family, mom and dad and a bunch of adult kids. And I noticed over a period of time, they always came late to everything. The whole family always came late to everything. And so at one point I asked the patriarch of the family, I said, what's the deal with you and your family always coming late to everything? And his answer surprised me. It was actually a strategy. And what he said was this: everybody waits for us, and we never wait for anybody. Everybody waits for us, we never wait for anybody. Do you hear the pride in that? Patience is always an act of humility. James chapter 4, we read this. Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will do this, or we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. Instead, you ought to say, if it's the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. James says, you have your plans and you have it all figured out, and this is the way it should work. We're going to do this, we're going to do that. But he says, you don't know. You say this is going to happen, that's going to happen, but you don't know. You ought to say, if it's the Lord's will. Now, when things go wrong in our lives, we think that our anger or our anxiety or our despair are feelings that we just can't help. But this verse is saying that those feelings arise from the assumption that we know what is best for us. There is an assumption that we know. When something bad happens, we say, oh, this is awful. Why? Because we know that if this happens, it's going to be terrible. So you know, do you? You know that for your life to have meaning, this has to happen and that can't happen. But this verse is saying, you don't know. You're upset, but you don't know. Please give up or lay down the burden of assuming that you know what is best. It's a great relief. Even the wisest person in the world can't foresee all that's going to happen. When we're freaking out because we think something has to happen, it means we think we know. But we're not all wise, and we don't know. The freaking out is coming from the assumption that you know what is best. Be humble. Be patient. Patience comes from choosing to be humble. Another way patience comes is through a choice of what we focus on. Normally when bad things happen to us, we get consumed with that bad thing. But rather we could focus on the thought of, I wonder, or this is a wonderful opportunity for me to grow into the person I and my spouse want me to be. For you see, when you meet trouble with patience, you turn into a different person. You grow into somebody good and great. The Bible says so in many different ways. This is James chapter 1. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you will be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Or Romans chapter 5. We glory in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance, character, and character, hope. And hope does not put us to shame because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit. You see, when bad things happen to you, if you meet it with patience, you're going to turn into a different person. You're going to turn into a person of character. Now, many of you know that I have electrical issues in my heart. Instead of the electrical impulses passing through the heart, they sometimes get trapped in this circle and keep going around and around and around, and my heart ends up doing double or triple time. Now, the procedure for that, or the cure for it, they put this gazmo up into your heart. They've got 5 fingers, and they open it up, and they can trace where the electricity is going wrong. And these things can get hot, and they burn. They can burn the inside of your heart. And the theory is, they cauterize it, the electricity can't get through the scar tissue, problem solved. It's a good theory, right? So they did this to me. It's called ablation. And I remember the doctor turning to me and saying, well, before they all start, he says, you gotta, they don't put you to sleep for this. You're awake. They give you some happy drugs, though. But you're awake. And beforehand, he's saying, when we're doing this, it's kind of important for you to lay still. Because once we burn your heart, we can't unburn it. And if you're jumping around, if you're flailing around, we might burn the wrong part. So lay still. And I remember him turning to me and says, okay, we're going to burn for 120 seconds. In other words, no flailing around. Some of you people think you've had heartburn? You ain't had heartburn until you sniff around. I wonder what they're barbecuing. No, you don't actually smell anything. You're too happy to know what's even going on. I should turn the page in my notes. To flail around during such a procedure would make things worse. For us, when we're in dark days, when dark days hit us, we can flail around and become bitter people, or we can wait with patience and be turned into a person of character, a person who has more peace at the end, a person of great character. Dark days do something to us. They do something to our prayer lives. They either destroy our prayer life or make us a great prayer. And everybody that I know who's a great prayer has been through dark days. So when trouble happens to you, see it as an opportunity for you to grow into the person that God wants you to be, that your spouse wants you to be, that your friends want you to be, that you want to be. And don't flail around. A key verse in the book of Job is Job 23, verse 10, and this is kind of my paraphrase of it. It says, God knows what he is doing to me, or he is doing with me. And that implies I don't know, and it implies patience. I don't know what God's doing. God knows, but I don't know. And when he has tested me, I will come forth as gold. Job says, because I'm going to meet this with patience, I'm going to grow, I'm going to become a different person. Waiting on God means not giving up, not flailing around, but being patient, even when we are confused and hurt and don't understand what's going on in our lives. Now, secondly, a second way to wait on God, or what it means to wait on God, is to wait with perspective. Verse 1 says, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. What's a rampart? That's just a fancy word for a tower. A rampart is just a tower. He stations himself in a tower. Now, why did cities in Habakkuk's day build towers? Towers enabled them to see what was coming. Down in the city, you can't see much. But you get up in the tower, you can see the enemy army coming. You can see the messenger that the other city is sending you. You can see troops arriving to rescue you. You can get perspective on your situation. So what does it mean spiritually when I say I'm going to wait on the Lord by going into a tower? What does that mean spiritually? In practice, what does that mean? It means that we don't just look at our problem by itself. Rather, we put it into the perspective of what the Bible teaches. Now, let me give you an example of Paul doing exactly this. Romans chapter 8, verse 18. He says, I consider, and that word consider is kind of a mathematical term. It means I've added it up. I've figured it out. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. Now, Paul had a lot of suffering. He lists a bunch of it at one point in the Bible. He talks about being stoned, not with drugs, but by people throwing rocks at your head, that kind of stoned. Beaten with whips, beaten with rods, being shipwrecked. He went hungry. He had physical problems with his eyes. He had all kinds of big sufferings in this world. And he's going into the tower and he's saying, if I just focus on my sufferings, they look really big. But when I put them into perspective, when I focus on the glory that will be revealed in eternity, my sufferings aren't worthy to be compared to that. This is very practical. Maybe you're physically sick, and you get into the tower and you say, oh, wait a minute, the only sickness that can really kill me is sin. And that's been forgiven. It's been paid for. Before, when we were preparing for communion, we looked at Psalm 21 about dying. And you can realize they might tell me, Russ, you got cancer and you got 3 months left to live. I can focus on that, or I can put it into perspective and say, well, really the only death that can hurt me is the second death. And that's been taken care of. We might be in debt. We might be in danger of losing our house because they're going to take it away from us. But we can say, put it into perspective. The only debt that is forever and ever is sin. And my debt has been paid. There are future riches in store for me. What is Paul doing in this verse? He is meditating upon the glory that will be revealed. And as he meditates, as he looks upon it, his suffering becomes smaller and smaller, and he can handle it. Now, do you do that? Do you know how to do that? Waiting on God is not a passive thing. It's active. It means thinking. It means working things out from a spiritual perspective. It means, in Paul's case, I'm going to think about the glory, God's glory, until my suffering becomes something I can handle. Thirdly, waiting on God means being obedient. This comes from verse 1 where it says, where Habakkuk writes, he uses the image of a guard and he writes, I will stand at my watch. This is a military image. If you're a guard on duty, it doesn't matter if you're having a bad day. It doesn't matter if you feel sick or if you're bored or if you're not getting anything out of it, or if you're sleepy. It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what your circumstances are, you can't leave your post. If you do, the whole city could be lost. You can't say, I've been up here the last 3 nights in a row. Nobody ever comes. I'm not getting anything out of this. I'm going to knock off early. I'm going home. It doesn't matter. You can't leave your post. You must do your duty. And this is Habakkuk's way of saying that even though he is struggling with God, and last time we looked at in chapter 1, he had big issues with God, and he's fighting with God. He says some very harsh things to God. But he's not going to leave his post. What this means for us is really simple. You may be weary. You may feel that God has forgotten all about you. You may feel that you're getting absolutely nothing out of your Christian walk. You may feel very confused by what's going on in your life. You may be experiencing disappointment after disappointment. None of your prayers are being answered. You pray and nothing happens. But you can't leave your post. You have to obey. Why? Because the word waiting doesn't mean just hanging around. It doesn't mean doing nothing. It means to serve. When you go to a restaurant, why do they call the servers waiters or waitresses? Because the word wait means to serve. One of the things waiting on the Lord means is I'm going to do what's right even when I don't feel like it. I do my duty even when I'm getting nothing out of it. Now, what often happens is when we are going into dark times, it's difficult. We're disappointed with God. And we stop doing the things that we usually do. We stop going to worship services. We stop going to our home church. We stop reading the Bible. We stop praying. We stop serving people. Why? Because we're filled with self-pity and we feel bad and we're not getting anything out of it. I can just imagine or picture the court-martial of the guard who left the duty. He left his watch. Standing before the judge, and the judge says, "Do you have anything to say?" And the guard says, "Well, yeah, I was up there night after night. I wasn't getting anything out of it, so I just left." And the judge says, "Oh, that explains it. Case dismissed." No, that's not the way it works. We need to stay faithful. So what? So what if we're getting nothing out of it? John Newton, the pastor, hymn writer of old, someone wrote to him and said, "I'm getting nothing out of praying." And Newton told him, "I can tell you, if you're getting nothing out of praying, you're going to get nothing out of not praying. If you get nothing out of going to the throne of grace each day, I can guarantee you will get nothing out of not praying." Habakkuk says, you just need to keep at it. You need to keep obeying. And obeying isn't just doing the things you know to do. It's also not doing the things you know you shouldn't do. During dark days, we tend to feel miserable. And there's a temptation for all of us. We want to feel good. We want to have something happen in our lives that makes us feel good. When Sharon and I were first married, she always knew when I had a bad day. You know how she knew? O. Henry wrapper in the car. Buy myself a chocolate bar. McDonald's, you deserve a break today. When we're facing bad days, evil days, we will always be tempted to do something with money, food, and sex that we know is wrong. And it's easy to give in. But to stay at your watch, to stand guard at your watch, is to resist those temptations. Can't leave your post. Waiting on the Lord means that no matter how dark the things are, no matter how dark it gets, you don't leave your post. You do what you're supposed to do. So waiting on the Lord means, first of all, it means being patient. Secondly, it means seeing things in perspective. And thirdly, it means being obedient. And lastly, waiting on the Lord means waiting on the Lord. Waiting on God Himself. It's not waiting for God's answer. It's not waiting for God's reward. It's waiting for God. Habakkuk has often been called a little book of Job. And in the book of Job, or the book of Job starts with Satan challenging God, and he asks the question, does Job serve God for nothing? And what What Satan is saying is, it looks like Job loves you, but he doesn't really love you. It looks like Job is waiting on you, but he's not waiting on you. It looks like Job is serving you, but he's not serving you. He's only serving you for what you can give him. Look at all the things that you give him, his family, his money, his fame, his success. If you take all of those things away from him, he will curse you. Job is not serving you because he loves you. He's serving you because he loves what he's getting from you. Now, you know that Satan is basically right about us, right? When we first start out with God, we do it because we get something from God. Maybe we feel guilty and we want to get rid of the guilt. We feel lonely or empty, or we need something from God. And so that's how we start out with God, because of what he will give us. It's okay to start there, but we shouldn't stay there, and here is why. When someone treats you that way, you get greatly offended. You know, you get this friend who shows up, they're your best buddy because they want something from you. And then they get it, and all of a sudden they're gone. For 6 months, you don't see it, you don't hear it, it's like they don't exist. And all of a sudden they're back. Why? Because they need you to give them something. And then they're gone again once they get it. You've all had friends like that, right? And it feels like you've been betrayed. But some of us got family like that. We don't like it when people treat us that way, but I hear people say, oh, I used to go to church. I used to pray, but God never answered. I never got anything out of it. So I stopped going. But all of a sudden I'm back because I got this problem in my life. What does it mean to wait on the Lord? It means to love him for himself and to remain faithful to him even when we are getting nothing out of it. It's only in times of trouble that we can turn our selfishness into real love for God. It's only when loving him gives you no benefit at all that you develop in your character. Last time we saw Habakkuk struggling greatly with God. He couldn't understand how God was allowing all this suffering and in fact was going to make it worse. And yet he stayed faithful to God. Why? Because he had become a servant of God who loved God for who he was or who he is. Now it's possible for us to get to that same spot. But normally we only get there through hard times, through dark days. God, when we enter a dark day, God is basically asking you, or saying to you, now we're going to find out if your relationship with me is for you to serve me or to get me to serve you. If you stick with God in dark days, you will be changed. There will be an unflappability about you. Fear will be gone. There will be a peace and a joy that you didn't know before. You will know that you can't be crushed. If you weren't crushed in this terrible thing, this dark day, you won't be crushed. Fear will be gone. So waiting on God involves, first of all, it involves patience. We wait. Secondly, it involves perspective. We see not just our problem, but it in a bigger picture, in God's picture. It involves obedience. We remain faithful. We stick to our post. And it involves waiting on God himself, not just on what God can give us. If dark days come to you, come to us. Let's be people who wait on the Lord like Habakkuk teaches. Let's sing.